Welcome to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where we sit down with people who give shape, texture, and voice to the stories that matter here on the North Fork of Long Island and sometimes far beyond. Some of our guests are rooted here by generations. Others join us from elsewhere to share their work, their perspective, or their connection to this community, but all bring something that adds to the ongoing conversation. We talk about what's changing, what's worth holding on to, and the currents of history, both quiet and loud, that run through this place. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 122, my guest today is John Broven, a man whose passion for music has carried him across both oceans and eras. Born and raised in England, John came of age with his ear tuned to a distant signal, the raw, unvarnished sound of American rhythm and blues. Not content merely to listen, he became a chronicler, a preservationist, and, one might say, a cultural translator between continents. Through his pioneering work with Blues Unlimited and his stewardship at Ace Records, John has helped bring to light the stories and songs of musicians who laid the groundwork for whose sounds form the bedrock of everything from rock and roll to soul to hip-hop. His book Walking to New Orleans and South to Louisiana are not only histories, they are acts of devotion, richly researched and deeply felt. In our conversation, we explore the formative friendships that shaped his early work, his first encounters with the backstreets and backbeats of New Orleans, and the indelible influence of artists like Professor Longhair and Huey Piano Smith. We discuss the challenges of historical fidelity, the roles of reissue labels in cultural memory, and what it means to carry a torch for music that refuses to be forgotten. So I hope you enjoy episode 122 with John Broven. This episode was recorded March 26, 2025. Thank you so much for coming on to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast. It's really a pleasure to have you on today.
Well, it's my pleasure to be here. I've come all the way from East Setauket, had a lovely journey down Sound Avenue, and here we are in lovely Greenport. And I have to add that I come from East Setauket via Cold Spring Harbour, via England.
Yes. Oh, wonderful. And also, in terms of just getting started, could you provide us a little introduction about yourself?
I'm what you would term a music history enthusiast, and I turned that enthusiasm into, first of all, writing for magazines and then writing books. It all started in England at Bexhill Grammar School, which is in the county of Sussex. Rock and roll had come on the scene. Elvis Presley and Bill Haley in the comments were making waves. And I was just a generation where that music impacted me. I was just so lucky to go to Bexhill Grammar School because in the same class was Mike Ledbetter, who turned out to be the co-founder of Blues Unlimited and in turn one of the greatest, most visionary blues researchers this world has known. Very sadly, Mike died at age 32. But there was no doubt that being in the same class, he was my mentor. Mm. And these rock and roll records, if you can visualize England had just come out of the austerity period, or was still in it in a sense, although we accepted that as everyday life. But you can imagine the glamour and the colour that America presented through its movies, and then the rock and roll records. And then when the rock and roll music was actually featured on movies like The Girl Can't Help It and Rock, Rock, Rock and so on, that just opened up our world. We were very lucky to have a record label called London American, which licensed a lot of the American hit records, but not only the hit records, but records that appeared on the low reaches of the charts, the rhythm and blues records, and they were, if you like, presented to us in one package. And if you can, we started to go to the record stores. We used to see record lists with names like Next Week Release, Ray Charles, What Did I Say, Bo Diddley, Cracking Up. And then when the records arrived in the shop, we went into the booths and we were never disappointed. And then the record label itself, London, the license, the company that they licensed from, you had Recorded by Sun, Memphis, Recorded by Atlantic, New York, Recorded by Chess, Chicago, Recorded by Imperial, Hollywood. These names just had a magic, and we wanted to know more. We wanted to know what was behind those records, know who the artists were, who the writers were, how the records came about. And Mike was a stimulus, not only for myself, but for many others.
And how old were you when you started listening to these records?
I would say in my mid-teens. And so, if you like, that was the music of the day. It was the hit music.
Yes.
And of course, the thing was, gramophone records, when I started buying with a 78 RPM, which is the fragile 10-inch records, but very soon the 45 RPM plastic and styrene records came in. But that was the latest technology. So in many senses, we felt that we were at the forefront. Another turning point for me was when I went to a record shop in Eastbourne in Sussex, which was the nearest big town to the village I lived in, my parents lived in. One day I noticed a pile of magazines in the corner of the manager's office, and I just said to him, what are those? And he said, Cashbox magazine. And then he said in the next breath, do you want them? Well, here was the major American trade magazine. He had the issues for the past year. And all of a sudden, that opened my world up to how the American record business was operating. So you had reviews of the pop records, you had reviews of the rhythm and blues records, reviews of the country and western. Then you had all the advertisements from companies like Atlantic, Chess, and so on. And that expanded my horizons no end. And that was, if you like, one of the stepping stones to advancing my interest. And then Mike had left school, and I told him I got these Cashbox magazines. And of course, he wanted to look at them. And between us, we started looking at the record adverts. And then we said, let's write to these companies. This is when Blues Unlimited was just being formed. And what we were saying was, look, this magazine has been formed. Would you like to send us records for review? Total off-the-wall request. Well, lo and behold, several companies did reply to us, and one of them was a big box in particular from Gold Band Records in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And I think I can honestly say that those were the first authentic Cajun records that anybody in Britain had heard, and that introduced us to the wonders of Cajun music.
Wow.
Literally just by writing to this Eddie Schuler in Lake Charles. And it transpired that we had a firm friend whenever we came over to the States. We stayed with Eddie Schuler, and we became firm friends. So it just shows, in a sense, how the thing started to mushroom.
But even with your time in school and coming out of school, did you know you wanted to work in or the field of music or be a historian?
Not at all.
No.
No. In my day, first of all, it was a rarity to go to university. This is something that I've learned since. But when I was graduating from grammar school, which is equivalent of high school, Cambridge University, Oxford University, the major universities were really for the aristocracy, for the elite.
And what year was this that you were? I mean, obviously before that, but in terms of when you were.
This was when I left grammar school was 1960.
Oh, okay.
And at that time, if you didn't go to university, then the main jobs were like being a traveling salesman, being in insurance, being in banking, and I went into banking, and that was my career. Midland Bank. I was there from 1960 through to 1991. I did reach managerial status, but so all of my music research was done in the evenings, weekends, part-time, and so on. So what happened with Blues Unlimited was a fundamental foundation stone. And Mike, with another grammar school person, Simon Napier, they formed Blues Unlimited in 1993. And the first issue was something like 200 copies. And I can still remember, you probably don't know the term stenograph, and the sheets were printed. We had them laid out on the table, and then we went up with a stapling machine and stapled 200 copies. But we just hit it just at the right moment. That there was a genuine interest in American blues and rhythm and blues music, and this really manifested itself in what we call the British blues boom, which was when groups like the Rolling Stones and the Beatles made their appearance. And their early records they were just copying Chuck Berry, the Miracles, you name it. So John Lennon, Paul McCartney, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards were listening to the same records that we were. It was just that they were very good musicians. And but the root of their music was American rock and roll. And so the whole scene started a mushroom. Mike said to me, and this is my first involvement, as I said to you, been writing to American record companies, and I had one or two record companies in particular. One was J.D. Miller down in Crowley, Louisiana, who recorded some wonderful swamp blues by artists like Slim Harpo, Lightning Slim, Lazy Lester. He'd written to me and given me a brief history of his time in the record business. Another label that wrote to me was Excello Records, Ernie Young, Excello Records of Nashville, Tennessee. And Mike said to me, well, we're starting this magazine. Are you going to write for the first issue? And I said to him, well, what on? Had no thought about it. And Mike just came straight back to me. He said, well, you've written to J. Miller and Crowley, haven't you? Write about him in the first issue of Blues Unlimited. And then literally 7 years, we made our first trip to the United States. J.D. Miller was on our journey. And again, we became firm friends. So it really started, Blues Unlimited was, if you like, the stepping stone.
Yes. And in terms of getting to was your first experience in the U.S. were you traveling to Louisiana?
Yes. Again, one has to remember in those days, the transatlantic air travel was purely for the select elite. The cost was out of our realm anyway.
Yes.
But some people like Bruce Bastin, a colleague in Sussex, he went to Houston in 1965. Mike went to Louisiana and Texas in 1967. And each time that they were writing about their exploits, and it was being published in Blues Unlimited, so the ball kept rolling. In my case, I decided to, with a friend, Robin Gosden, and with Mike, we made our first trip to the United States in 1970. And we stayed in, the first port of call was New Orleans. And we stayed there for a long weekend. We stayed at the house of James La Rocca. His mother owned a record company in New Orleans in '63, which we had no idea at the time. But James was a subscriber to Blues Unlimited. So it just shows how that network was expanding. And James really acted as our driver. And that's where I met these just... yes, it's not been exceptional to say that they were legends. We met Professor Longhair, living in very dire circumstances in his apartment on South Rampart Street. We met Huey Piano Smith, who had had a top 10 record in 1958, living in, again, poor circumstances. Archibald, the pianist, who'd had a hit record in 1950 with Stacker Lee. We went to his house, I think it was 4th Street, and it was a rainy Saturday morning. I can still remember he escorted us into his living room, and he had a piano there. And can you believe that he gave us a piano concert in his own home? And here was, I know that you know, but New Orleans has got a great piano tradition. And so here were two great pianists, Archibald, Professor Longhair. Huey Smith was another pianist. And yet their era was almost over. The Jazz Fest hadn't started, which again was a great platform for these local artists in years to come. Professor Longhair, his career was revived for the next 10 years that he lived. Archibald sadly died in 1973. There was talk about him coming over to Europe, but it never happened. And Huey Smith just played 1 or 2 concerts, and that was it. But we were just so fortunate to have met these artists all in one weekend. And then we went off to Baton Rouge, down to Crowley, met J.D. Miller, Lake Charles, Eddie Schuler. But when we came back, Mike said to me, music history books were just coming into being. If you suppose think about it, the rock and roll era was the 50s, early 60s. Well, it takes a little bit of time for the histories to manifest themselves. So really, the early 70s was when a lot of books on blues, rhythm and blues, rock and roll came out. And again, just shows the influence Mike had. But he said to me, well, when you're going to write a book? Well, I never thought of writing a book. And of course, the next, very persuasive, you can, in a very next line, he said, well, you've just been to New Orleans, haven't you? Write about the history of New Orleans rhythm and blues music. And just to give you a bit of background, in the 1960s, while Blues Unlimited was expanding, a lot of the focus was on the blues of Chicago and the Delta, and the big cities. The music of the big cities had been rather overlooked. So what it meant was that New Orleans really had not been covered, and so I was the first in the door.
Wow.
And I know that you lived in New Orleans, but you can appreciate this, that at that time a lot of families were still there. You know, there hadn't been, it wasn't until Hurricane Katrina came along, you had the big diaspora, that the residents spread out. But when I went to New Orleans, you know, all these, I would say 90% of these great artists were still there. So I went back in 1973 with my tape recorder, stayed with James, who acted as my driver again, and literally just driving around New Orleans with my tape recorder, arranging appointments. But a benefit was James's mother, Connie, as I said, had a record company, and she was so very well liked, and so she would just pick up the phone to people like Clarence Frogman Henry, one of the big artists down there, Earl King, another big artist, and just said, come to my home, John wants to interview you. So I didn't have to do trekking the streets of New Orleans.
Looking for artists.
They came to me.
Could she be related to Nick LaRocca, the cornetist? and trumpeter.
That's right. The family history goes back to Nick LaRocca, who was the brother of Connie's husband, Pete, and Nick was the leader of the original Dixieland jazz band, who are credited with making the first jazz recording, not only in New Orleans, but anywhere, in 1917, a record called Livery Stable Blues. And when we met Connie, as I say, I had no idea that she operated this really special record label called Frisco in the early 60s. But also there was a family history there. So I think we were very privileged as young Blues Unlimited researchers to be staying at their house. And then for James to literally act as a driver to escort us to meet all these great New Orleans rhythm and blues figures.
Was it pretty easy in terms of setting up these interviews and finding these artists for the most part, or?
No, there's obviously a network, and
Yes.
once you sort of break into that network and the word gets around, and those artists who wanted to be interviewed would. There are obviously some who didn't want to be interviewed. I tried. The biggest artist was Fats Domino. He was playing with Dave Bartholomew, another big artist, at the Fontainebleau Hotel down in New Orleans. And I kept saying, Fats, can we have an interview? And he said, well, call me 1 o'clock. No, tomorrow, and we'll arrange something then. Well, you called at 1 o'clock, and then it was complete diversion. But that really is part of it. On the other hand, I was able to interview the only studio owner, Cosmo Matassa, who was had the main studios in New Orleans from 1940s through to the late 1960s, early 70s. And he was one of those dream interviewees where, full of colourful local phrases, but he had a wonderful memory. And so, the stories you got from Cosmo sort of really. And it was the only studio in town. That was the other point.
Wow.
So really, I had the full history at my fingertips. So that I came back, transcribed the tapes. I'd already written a draft, and hey presto, my first book, Walking to New Orleans, the story of New Orleans rhythm and blues, came out in 1974. So we've just had the 50th anniversary. So I don't know what that says about me or the book, but
No, that's amazing. But also, I was just curious because, like you mentioned, I grew up there through the 90s and into the 2000s. But I was curious what you thought of New Orleans in the early 70s, just the environment and what you initially thought of the area.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes, it was. You had the segregated areas, and the artists, the rhythm and blues artists that we were interested in, were almost all black. You had white artists like Frankie Ford, Jerry Byrne, and so on.
Yes.
So, we were, if you like, white kids going into the projects. Now, we were helped by, first of all, being English. So whatever, sort of taints the segregation. You couldn't level it. That was between Americans and America.
Yes.
We were, came in, from the outside. So that helped. Another thing that helped was you have to know your subject.
Mm-hmm.
And, we'd, written about the music. We were primarily record collectors. Mm-hmm. So we knew the background. And so we knew what questions to ask. So that meant that, once an artist or record man or studio owner knew what we were talking about, or knew that we were talking about, their story, and asked the right questions, then that paved the way. I remember one occasion where Professor Longhair was Saturday night was playing across the tracks, across the river, somewhere like Algiers, and I said, "Oh boy, this is just going to be wonderful to see Professor Longhair play in a black club." And James, who lived in New Orleans, said, "I don't think we ought to go there." And Mike then said, "I don't think we ought to either." Well, if Mike Ledbetter, felt that this situation wasn't right, then long and short of it was we didn't go. So you had to be careful. Mm-hmm. You had to be mindful of your of the environment. Mm-hmm. But I can say we never had a single problem. Mm-hmm. I think because we were careful, but because we had a mission.
Yes. And do you think the artists understood they knew what you were doing in terms of, when you were asking them questions about their music or their life, and they were pretty open to discussing that?
Yes. Again, you had to explain, give them the backdrop, and in a sense, you were having to prove yourself. But I can remember after New Orleans, Walking to New Orleans was published, I went to Los Angeles in 1975, and there was still a few New Orleans musicians and artists living out there. One of them was the great Roy Brown, who was a pioneer in the 1940s, 1950s, and his story just hadn't been covered at all. And I put the microphone in front of him, just started off about his Good Rockin' Tonight, recording for Deluxe, and whoosh, he was away. So that story that had never been told, there it was, and I was able to incorporate that in the second edition. Yes, what happened was Walking to New Orleans was published by Blues Unlimited, by the magazine, which was, we'd never published a book before. Luckily, we had printers, Unwin Brothers in Woking, Surrey, a lovely lady called Janet Baker, and she really guided us through the whole process. So that was what we call a bit of a wing and a prayer, but it all came out beautifully. And then somehow Milburn Calhoun of Pelican Publishing in Gretna, Louisiana, which is just across the river from New Orleans, wrote to us one day and said, "We would like to license the book for New Orleans and Louisiana for the United States." Well, that was just wonderful, because what it meant was he'd be able to get the book into the tourist shops, into the educational system, which we never could from England.
Mm.
So we signed a contract, and then he said, I don't think Americans will understand the title Walking to New Orleans. He said, let's make it rhythm and blues in New Orleans, nice and simplistic.
Mm.
What do you do? He obviously didn't realise Walking to New Orleans was a famous Fats Domino's song. I thought it had lovely connotations. An Englishman, how do you get to New Orleans? Walking across the Atlantic Ocean and so on. But all those lovely subtleties went out the window.
Yeah.
But the point was, Chris, that Pelican published the book. It's come to 3 editions now. I had the chance to update it in 2016. It's still available, and altogether, those 2 books, or the single book, but those publications have sold in excess of 25,000 copies.
Wow.
So, I'm very grateful to what Melbourne and Pelican did.
Yeah.
But then what happened was, when the book was published over here, it it did start to do well. And so then Melbourne came to me and said, is there another book you'd like to write? And of course, that's like a dream come true to an author, isn't it? Rather go chasing with agents and go around publishing houses.
Yeah.
There was the commission right in front of me. And you'll know this, but New Orleans sort of spreads out into South Louisiana, and there's, if you like, an interaction between the music of New Orleans and South Louisiana. Yes, during my search for New Orleans, I picked up a lot of historical facts about Louisiana music. So I said to him, how about a book on South Louisiana music? It was exactly the same thing. It was a history within basically the post-World War years, when the record business, the independent record business, expanded. And for the first couple of decades, Louisiana was pretty isolated. And what it meant was that it retained its individual musical sound. And so the book was called South to Louisiana. It was published in 1983. And like Walking to New Orleans, which was based on a hit song, South to Louisiana is a famous local song by a great singer called Johnny Allen. So those 2 meshed together very nicely. And what I did, I documented the history of Cajun music. In fact, I went back to the 1930s when the first Cajun record was made in 1928, Joseph Falcon at Lafayette, and documented the Cajun history, and then went into Zydeco music, which was Clifton Chenier was the king of Zydeco, Rockin' Doopsie, Buckwheat. Those were the pioneers, if you like.
Yes.
Then I went into the blues side, which was if you remember, I was talking about J.D. Miller and Crowley, writing to him in 1962. He basically created the swamp blues and just a totally individualistic sound. But he had his own recording studio, and then he licensed these recordings to Excello in Nashville for national distribution. And then we came into the rock and roll. the white rock and roll, and it was rock and roll performed by Cajun teenagers. And, to make a splash, these young artists wisely realized that they couldn't, Johnny's real name was Guillaume, Bobby Charles was Guidry. They became anglicized, if you like.
Yes.
But they still had the soul of Cajun music, their Cajun heritage. And so what I was able to do was to sort of meld it all together and to say, no, this is just not Cajun, it's not Zydeco, it's not swamp blues, it's or white rock and roll. This is a natural Louisiana heritage. Just as Walking to New Orleans represented New Orleans rhythm and blues, which was a direct off-link of New Orleans jazz, Dixieland. After rhythm and blues, it went into funk, the meters, and then soul, and then hip-hop. But I suppose one of the achievements of South to Louisiana was, and again, I don't know quite how it began, but the term of South Louisiana rock and roll was just too unwieldy. And so we came up, and we just can't pinpoint, whether it's Bill Miller or Charlie Gillett, but guys in England, we started calling it swamp pop. And so it was popular music out of the swamps.
Yeah.
But it had that nice direct ring. And can you believe that South to Louisiana popularized that term of swamp pop? And now there is actually a swamp pop museum.
Wow.
In Ville Platte, Louisiana. So in England, we've got this wonderful term called coals to Newcastle. This is, in other words, Newcastle was a mining town, and you don't take coals into Newcastle. Well, here we are taking coals, the swamp pop coals to Louisiana.
Yeah.
So that brings us into, I say it's published in 1983, and I was I started doing commissions for English record companies, compilations, labels. The whole reissue business was mushrooming. And I suppose at this stage, I should say that I don't think the Americans realise just what an impact their music has had throughout the world.
Yes.
The whole reissue business in England, the record reissue business, was based on American music.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just England, Holland, Sweden, France, Australia, right across the world.
Yeah.
And Japan.
Yes.
Japan was a major, they had this interest in American music.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, I feel that, to this day, that more respect ought to be given to the American artist and the record man and the whole pioneers of the industry, because the impact was, yes, we all know American movies is a worldwide phenomenon, but American music, in England, they still have rock and roll weekends, where the kids dress up
Yeah.
in 1950s. The girls in flared skirts, teddy boys, and the winkle picker shoes, and it's just wall to wall rock and roll music for the whole weekend.
Yeah.
In New Orleans, after the Jazz Fest has done a wonderful job in if you like, spreading the word about local music.
Yeah.
It's got a bit too big now. They bring in a lot of rocks, and they bring in the Dylans and the Springsteens, and so on. But of course, the original artists, there's so few of them, even alive now, let alone playing.
Yeah.
So, again, that's another factor. I just think my generation was just so fortunate to have had the chance of not only to buy the records, to write about them, but to see them in person, and then to meet them, become friends. That will never be repeated.
No.
Just can't.
No, it's that was a special time.
It really was. It really was. And I don't know if you were aware of this in New Orleans. They had an organisation called the Ponderosa Stomp, run by Ara Padnos, called him Dr. Ike. It was an annual festival, and he used to bring, book as many original artists as he could. Be it blues, be it Zydeco, be it Cajun, swamp pop, you name it. And he kept that running through the early 2000s. The last one was 2017. But he's realised that the original artists are just not there anymore to book. So why try to carry on?
Yeah.
Another big festival, just to give you an idea of the worldwide influence, is the Blues Estafette in Holland, which used to be like an annual pilgrimage for us. It was held every November. We took the boat or the plane to Holland, stayed in Amsterdam. The festival was held in Utrecht, and the promoter Jaap Hendricks, again, a bit like Ara Padnos, booked every available, if you like, I think you call roots artist that he could. So the Music Centrum was full to capacity, and that was another great way of exposing these great American artists who very often couldn't find work over here.
Yeah. No, that always fascinated me, and just seeing those, whether some of them were popular at a certain time, but then just seeing them, like you said, even specifically with Professor Longhair going through like the starting late 50s into the 60s, and then just nothing, and then sort of having a revival later in the 70s. But just, it's interesting seeing that with artists.
Yes, and it was just wonderful to see them recognised, if you like, at the in their twilight years. And when we started writing, of course, that was one of our main objectives, was to spread the word about this artist, and then their records would be released, and then maybe they would come over to Europe, and we just saw so many, thanks to the promoters and various people, we just saw so many terrific artists in England in the 1960s, particularly the Chicago artists, people like John Lee Hooker, Jimmy Reed, Howlin' Wolf, Little Walter, Sonny Boy Williamson. And I tell you what, not one of them disappointed.
Mm-hmm.
They just lived up to the reputation that we built up,
Yeah.
if you like, amongst our readers. And but it was exhilarating.
Yes. And then also, could you talk about your work with Ace Records?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. So, as I said, I've been doing these occasional commitments. This was the days of LP. Time moves on, doesn't it? This is LP, the original long-playing records. You had the cover, you had the sleeve, you had the liner notes, and yes, I got commissions from EMI. I did a series on Fats Domino, a series on Smiley Lewis, Amos Milburn. EMI, of course, was the company that the Beatles recorded for, so it's one of the biggest companies in England. And then Ace Records asked me to do, well, now this is after Walking to New Orleans had been published, and then South to Louisiana. So I got a reputation as being knowledgeable about the New Orleans and South Louisiana music. So whenever those type of compilations came up, they asked me. So what happened in 1991, I still wasn't yet 50. Midland Bank went through one of these mad periods, and I think every major corporation did. They all followed one another. They basically took out the middle management stream, which was the point that we'd reached. So I had early retirement while still in my late 40s. And what do I do? Well, let's try and make my hobby into a business. And so I mentioned earlier Bruce Baston, who went to Houston. He knew Trevor Churchill at Ace Records, made an introduction. I'd already written liner notes, so I wasn't new to them. And so they asked, this was when the CD revolution was just exploding. And Ace had one consultant, compiler, Ray Topping, and he just couldn't handle it all. So the Midland Bank did me a great favour. They gave me early retirement. They gave me a pension. Stupid, really, at that early age. And I was able to, if like, do a dream job. So I was particularly useful with my contacts in New Orleans and South Louisiana. And Ace, although it was only a small company, were very enterprising. It wasn't just sort of working from your armchair at home. They actually sent us to the United States to basically to make deals, to license recordings to be reissued in London, in England, in Europe. And so I was able to, if like, reacquaint myself with some of my original interviewees, like Harold Baptiste, who had AFO Records in New Orleans. His label had not been touched by the reissuers at all. So that manifested itself in a series called Gumbo Stew. Eddie Schuler of Gold Band Records in Lake Charles, his deal with Charlie Records had come to an end. So I was dispatched to Lake Charles, like a little kid in a haystack with these tapes of artists like Duke Boy Bonner and Ari Lejeune and Cleveland Crochet and so on. So we were able to, Ace Records were able to arrange that licensing deal. Again in New Orleans, Connie LaRocca, where we stayed at her home, her little label Frisco had not been touched. So we were able to do the first reissue series.
Wow.
So, yes, Ace sent me to New Orleans, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, and then New York. And that's how New York was a turning point, because we had this great series called The Golden Age of American Rock and Roll, which was the top 100 hits, American top 100 hits between 1954 and 1963. And, with the CD boom coming out, we wanted to get the best sound possible. So you would go to these companies and extract the master tapes and so on. And, one of the recordings we wanted was Tall Call One by the Wailers on Golden Crest Records. And to all intents and purposes, Golden Crest had disappeared from the face of the earth. It was a company run out of, it was a Long Island company based in Huntington Station. And, but through a good friend of ours, Don Folletti in Hackensack, New Jersey, he found out that the publishing company, CFG Publishing, was still registered with BMI, Broadcast Music Inc. in New York. And lo and behold, there was the address. So wrote to CFG Publishing Company, and there was the inheritor of the record label, Shelley Galehouse King. And I always say I ended up with two contracts. One was the record of Tall Call One. The other one was In Marriage. And so thanks to Ace Records, thanks to the Wailers' Tall Call One, I was able to meet up with Shelley, and we found we were single. And that's how I came out to live here in the United States. We married in 1995. So you can say that my musical journey is sort of had this wonderful finale that who would have known, from a lad at grammar school, listening to the first rock and roll records, that it would lead me on this wonderful journey.
Yes. No, that's a wonderful blend of kind of balancing, going back and forth and exploring Louisiana and California and New York, and then eventually settling over in the United States full time.
Yes, it was very interesting. We had to make a decision. Do we live in England? Do we live in the United States? And I felt that I was more acquainted with the American social structure than Shelley would have been in England. And the other thing was, she had her business interests here, particularly with Golden Crest. So what we did was to sign another deal, not only for the Wailers, but for the Golden Crest label. And so Ace have done at least 4 CDs, covering the Golden Crest popular catalogue. It also included classical music, ragtime, jazz, and so on. But we were just interested in the rock and roll and so on. But an interesting sideline with Golden Crest was Shelley's father, Clark Galehouse, he was a saxophone player in Chicago in the 1930s, the jazz era. Played at clubs owned by Al Capone and so on. Really in the heart of it. And then he came to Long Island, set up this pressing plant, and then set up a recording studio, and then his own label. But he had a brilliant idea of recording local high school orchestras. And so he was able to go to Smithtown East or wherever, set up his recording equipment. There were probably about 30 or 40 kids in the orchestra. And then he would go back to Huntington Station and press the records, a nice cover. And of course, every kid wanted an album, didn't they? But not only that, but their aunties, their uncles, their mums, their grandparents. So it was a wonderful, it was very altruistic in the sense of, the kids were playing the orchestra, and here's my LP. And then, but he was able to sell it to the family and so on and so on. And he had the pressing plant so he could press fairly cheaply. So that was one of the many attributes, if you like, of Golden Crest. So Shelley and I were able to, if you like, reinvent the label. Yes. And we did it with the help of Ace Records. And then, so I was working with Ace from 1991 to 2006, 15 years. It was pretty easy with email and so on. It's almost like person in the next room, and yet it was across the Atlantic, different time zones. I would go back once every 2 months for meetings and so on, and it worked out beautifully. But then I thought, well, I'm meeting all these great people in the record industry. Let me put it all together and do the history of the independent record business through the words of the original record people, record men and women. So I was able to write Record Makers and Breakers, which documented the independent record business. And if you can think of it, Chris, I was interviewing pioneers in the 1990s who started out in the 1940s. Well, they were then in their 70s and 80s. They're no longer here. But I was able to document their stories firsthand as to how the independent business grew, went from segmented rhythm and blues music, segmented hillbilly music, merged into rock and roll music. And you can imagine the stories that came firsthand, how Joe Bahari recorded B.B. King, how Ahmet Ertegun, Atlantic Records in New York, great record label, great record man, how he started. Jerry Wexler, who lived in East Hampton, another early partner in Atlantic Records, just great characters. Great friend of ours, Hy Weiss, Old Town Records of New York, lived in Woodbury. He became a family friend. It was, I say, almost, you couldn't make it up, as they say. So I'm just so proud of that book, and I look at it now, and I don't think I could have done any better, and mainly because the personalities were just that. That they were personalities who had achieved so much, by starting from literally nothing, a whole business, where the major labels, the RCA Victors, the Columbias, just weren't interested in the blues artists of the Delta or Memphis, the rhythm and blues artists of New Orleans. And these guys came together. So another favourite of mine was Bobby Robinson of Fire Records. He had a record shop in Harlem, and we, just another part of the story, in 85, Blues Unlimited had really run out of steam. Mike had died, 10 years old earlier, and there was a committee in charge of the magazine, and it just was starting to falter. So 3 of us started a new magazine called Duke Blues, and that started in England in 85. Very proud of it. Scylla Huggins was the editor, and her husband Mick was an graphic art designer. Beautiful magazine, lasted about 70 issues. Well, when it started, we said, well, what impactful stories can we make? And it occurred to us that New York, the New York blues scene, had been totally overlooked. So much so that certain people in England were making fun of us, going to New York for, to document the blues scene. What blues scene? And
they just assume more in the South, or
exactly, yes. And of course, New York, there's so much going on there, isn't there? That the blues is sort of just one compartment, if you like. But a lot of the original artists were still there. Bobby Robinson in particular, who started his first record company in the early 50s, but he opened his record shop in 1945. He literally was one block away from the Apollo Theatre. So all the artists used to come in to see him. All the record men used to come. So he got a feel of what was happening in Harlem. I like to call it the street beat of Harlem. And so he started his record companies, and he just captured that, if you like, that earthy sound, invigorating as well. It wasn't just doomy blues music. Bobby recorded rhythm and blues, particularly good on vocal groups, what we know as doo-wop music. And then lo and behold, in 1959, he had a number 1 hit record in the nation, Kansas City by Wilbert Harrison. Now, if you saw that little record shop on 125th Street, literally a hole in the wall, you think, goodness, how could you have a number 1 pop record in the nation? And Bobby did it. Almost broke him. Couldn't keep up with the pressing bills. The distributors wouldn't pay him.
Yeah.
It was, how should we say, it was chaos. But one story I love to tell is the guitar player in Kansas City. And I think it's a wonderful thing these days. I can mention these songs. When we started off, you had to search for the records. Some were very rare, some could be very expensive, but you had to physically hunt them down. Nowadays, I can mention Kansas City, Wilbert Harrison. You can go onto YouTube and you know exactly what I'm talking about. So Kansas City was number 1 in 1 week, and then the very next week another New York record was number 1. Dave Baby Cortez, The Happy Organ.
Yes.
So 2 records in 2 weeks, wonderful. But the great piece of the story is it was the same guitar player on both records, Wild Jimmy Spurrell. And to this day, I say there ought to be a monument in how many people achieved that in their lifetimes. 2 number 1 records, guitar solos on both of them. Mm-hmm. But it was at that time when session men just didn't get any credit. Mm-hmm. So nobody, unless you recognise the sound, unless you knew him, knew that it was Jimmy Spurrell. So again, that's a lovely thing in our writings.
Yes.
That make people aware of this great history. Mm-hmm. So fast forwarding, this is the last major book that I was involved in, New York City Blues. And it was authored by Larry Simon. It was edited by myself and made some contributions. And there you are. That's Jimmy Spurrell on the front cover. So we've elevated Jimmy Spurrell to his rightful position.
Wow.
So that book came out. Unfortunately, it came out just in the middle of COVID. So we were unable to do any publicity. And sad to say, no New York institution has taken any notice of it. Couldn't get a review in the New York Times, nowhere. But
it's odd.
It's not any odd, but it's sad.
It's sad, yeah.
This is just a great history. Many. Really, it's Harlem, sort of at its best, and then Harlem at its worst, and then Harlem reviving itself. But the nice story is that Larry Simon is a musician, a guitarist, and he brought several of the original artists together, including Jimmy Spurrell and another famous artist, Roscoe Gordon, who came from Memphis originally, lived in Queens or Regis Park. And Larry's a very good musician, organised a band and was able to get gigs along the eastern seaboard and over to Europe, including the Blues Estafette in Utrecht, which I mentioned earlier. So, Larry has really done his part, but those articles, original articles that we did in Duke Blues, I think spurred the interest in people saying, oh, there is a New York blues scene.
Yes, just making that more aware, or people just didn't know anything. They didn't know that was even there.
That's right. And I think that, you are right that other centres, are seen as natural blues centres.
Yeah.
And, but there was a thriving club scene in New York, particularly in Harlem. And of course, the whole thing was sent at the Apollo Theatre, where you had the national black stars come in, and that added a whole new dynamic. And just to finish off with Bobby Robinson, he was always undercapitalized, but he did actually go into the hip-hop era and had one or two early hip-hop and rap hits. And so Bobby really saw it all, from rhythm and blues and doo-wop right through to the hip-hop. But he said that the hip-hop guys, he said, were just unmanageable. Just, he was happy to deal with people like Wilbert Harrison and Jimmy Spurrell and so on.
Yeah.
But these young rappers, it was another game.
It was harder to... Yeah.
Enough said.
But also, I had a question with the work earlier, with your work in New Orleans, with the two books, Walking to New Orleans,
yes,
and South Louisiana.
Yeah.
You were inducted into the Louisiana Hall of Fame. What did that mean to you?
Oh, it's to be acknowledged, particularly being an outsider. When I say an outsider, being clearly an Englishman,
Yeah.
coming into Louisiana, and
but also, really, you were helping to revive and bring to light some of these artists that were kind of had faded from being, whether they were more out and about in the 40s and early 50s, but just preserving that history. And
yes, by making people aware of a term I don't really like, but rich history of their wonderful background, what they had achieved. And then time passes, time moves on, doesn't it? And so, yes, all of a sudden, their style was in, and then the next day, literally, it was out.
Yeah.
But by putting the focus on them, not just myself, there are a lot of other authors in New Orleans, Louisiana, just by writing about them, making people aware. And then you had, like the Ponderosa Stomp, you had the Jazz Fest, and you had lots of festivals, as you know, in South Louisiana, where a lot of Cajun bands sort of get the opportunity to play, and Zydeco as well. So everybody was helping to uplift the appreciation of these original artists. But I think, from my perspective, not only have I been interested in the artist, in their music as a record collector, but I do take a great interest in the business side. And this is where I think, my banking background helped me to understand how these little independent companies like Bobby Robinson basically undercapitalized. But what they did to preserve, if they hadn't have done it, who would have done?
Yes.
And you'd have just had the music. These musicians would have played in the clubs, and in those days there was no tape recorders, nothing.
Nothing would have been preserved.
Not at all. So I just feel that these record men and women, aided by supremely talented artists, have between them done a lot to make America proud. And yes, just on that score, great source of pride is that Shelley passed, unfortunately, in 2013, but her Golden Crest label, her family label, was acquired by the Library of Congress. So I just feel that couldn't ask for anything more.
Yes.
What a wonderful accolade. There it is in the National Archive. Hopefully forever.
Yes.
It wasn't until a few months ago. But and then at the same time, the library acquired part of my record collection and my tape files.
Wow.
And my papers. So again, I look back, husband and wife independently having their collections in the Library of Congress. So so it's been a wonderful journey, Chris.
Yes.
I have to pinch myself.
No, that's wonderful to see all that, and then see all your work be accepted into this organization, archive, and preserved.
That's the yes, if you like, that's the final stamp, really. The accolade.
Yeah.
And just so fortunate, with my collection, the Library of Congress, there was a big gap in their collection of these independent labels.
Mm-hmm.
So, all the records that I had on chess, checker, Duke, XLO, VJ, just filled a big gap in their collection. And so I feel very fortunate that that they wanted it and I was able to provide it. And I'm afraid, as we get, the aging process goes along, at least I don't have to worry about what's going to happen to my collection of 45s and 78s. They are nicely lodged in the Library of Congress.
Absolutely. And then I had a question. Just looking through blues and R&B music through the decades, what are your thoughts on the current state of blues and R&B today?
It's interesting. I'm working on in fact, I've got a commission for Ace Records of London at the moment. It's the, can you believe it's the 80th anniversary of Modern Records, which was started in Los Angeles in 1945. The label was acquired by Ace around about 1990. And they've done a wonderful job in reissuing that whole catalogue. The major artist is B.B. King, but a lot of other famous names like John Lee Hooker, Jimmy McCracklin, and so on. But the point is that just running through the biographies, it's an 8 CD set. It's also the 50th anniversary of Ace Records. We can only find one artist who's still alive. When you think that they were performing in the 40s, 50s, primarily, if they're still alive, they'd be in their 90s now.
Yes.
So really, a roundabout answer to your question, it's a whole new scene out there. There's a legacy scene where particularly artists like B.B. King, you can still hear his guitar style in so many of the blues guitarists. The rhythm and blues side was taken over by soul music. And then now, of course, we have the rap and hip-hop, which, yes, you can say there was a continuing line there, but it's lost a lot of the original impact. Now, if you look at photographs of the shows at the Apollo Theatre in the 50s, everybody was dressed up for showtime. The artists, the members of the band, the whole thing glittered. Now it almost seems to be sort of, okay, it's high-priced designer, uniforms and what have you. But to me, it's lost that that magic.
Kind of some like a realness to it, and I don't know if say like a superficial aspect to it today.
Now these artists from the 40s and 50s really learnt their trade.
Yes.
On the Chitlin circuit, playing these little clubs in
Mm-hmm.
Mississippi and Alabama, and
Yeah.
but you learned your craft. Nowadays, it seems as if you want to be a superstar right from day one without going through the whole mechanics of the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no doubt that there are, but it's mainly white blues artists.
Mm.
The black artists, those who are not in that sort of hip hop rap regime, are, you would say, they are sophisticated soul artists.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole, I think we've lost a lot of that down home sort of earthiness.
Yes.
That was born out of social conditions, let's face it.
Yes.
But it did provide, some wonderful music.
Yes. Absolutely.
I take a passing interest in today's scene, but it doesn't grab me
Hasn't grabbed you
as it did as a 14-year-old in Bexhill
Yes.
Grammar School. So.
Yeah. And then even just looking, even if you could revisit one era or moment in music history, what would it be and why?
Well, if you refer to, I can think of one concert. I can give an example of one concert when Fats Domino's orchestra came to London in 1967, and it was at the Savile Theatre, which was owned by Brian Epstein, who was the Beatles' manager. And he put his money into the Savile, and was booking acts like Fats Domino. I can remember the Friday night. I don't know if you know London. It's on the Strand. Really in central London, quite near Trafalgar Square.
Okay.
Almost opposite the Savoy Hotel, and but you can imagine the excitement that we had of. This is the first time Fats had played in England, and he'd had his full band. Wow. I don't know, 10 pieces, 12 pieces. And I can still remember the gauze curtain, and there was the band silhouetted in the background. And they did it was almost like a rumba. It was almost... Professor Longhair's song Mardi Gras in New Orleans, and you thought, hey, this is not really the Fats Domino music that we just loved on record. And then the curtain raised, there was Fats sitting at the piano, smiling. They went into Blue Hill, and I tell you, the whole audience just melted. It was just perfect. Just perfect. Plus the fact that he had his New Orleans, every member of the band sort of had New Orleans roots. And it was just the perfect incarnation of New Orleans rhythm and blues. And
coming to you live in London.
In London,
yeah.
Which we thought would never happen. And if you can think, how many members in the band? 10 members. The airfares, the hotels, and so on and so on. But a funny story about that concert. We were a little sort of head in the air and so on. The opening act, we thought, we're not going to worry about those. We just come to see Fats Domino, who took up the second half. Well, the opening act was the Bee Gees. It was I think it was their first appearance in London, and should have really stayed. And but to us, that they weren't rhythm and blues. They didn't have Fats's track records. So, but that was a spectacular concert. But as for the era, I suppose there's always a sense of, we're a little bit too late. We missed the best moments, and so we tried to catch up, particularly when we started Blues Unlimited. We realised what a great history there was in the Chicago blues scene, and so we made every effort to not only interview the artists but to buy the records that we could. And so record collectors out there, if you mention the name of Cobra or J.O.B., they just raise their hands. But we'd missed that, if you like, by 5 years, and we thought we were too late. But of course we weren't. We were at the forefront of blues research.
Yes. And also, just looking forward, are there any upcoming projects or releases that you're particularly excited about that you're working on?
Well, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I'm working on this box set of modern records for Ace Records. It's 8 CDs. It covers the blues, rhythm and blues and vocal group era from 1945 to 1959. That is due out at the end of the year, and that's keeping me nicely preoccupied. I've got a presentation coming up in May for an organisation called ARSC, A-R-S-C, who are having an annual conference. It's a record collectors organisation. And I'm giving a presentation on the New York record men at their conference, which is in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So that's going to feature heavily Bobby Robinson and Jimmy Sporrell. So hopefully spread the word a little bit more about what a great scene, blues scene New York had. Another record man I would discuss is Juggy Murray, who made the first Ike and Tina Turner recordings in the early 60s on a label called Sue. And then I finish off by going back to New Orleans, of course, and with Harold Baptiste, who I interviewed in 1975, who had a link up with Juggy Murray, but it all ended up in tears. And so I suppose what I'm saying is that although you had these black record men, when they did have the chance to work together, sometimes it ended in tears rather than in joy. And but Harold's greatest moment was, I don't know if you remember Sonny and Cher, I Got You Babe, that marvellous arrangement. That was Harold when he was living on the West Coast. So, these guys, there's just so much, just so much history. And again, without sort of overstressing the point, it deserves to be preserved, deserves to be remembered. But not only from the historical point of view, but from the musical point of view. And I always say that for any young musicians, study these records. The sax solos, Lee Allen sax solos. The most wonderful New Orleans drummer who made it on the West Coast was Earl Palmer. And I say, any young drummer, listen to Earl Palmer's records and learn from it. He had that drive, he had that rhythm. Dave Bartholomew, the producer in New Orleans, said that you could time Earl to the second, and he would say to Earl 2 minutes 15 seconds, when records were that short, and Earl would just sort of wind a mystical clock on his ankle,
yes,
and lo and behold, the final note was 2:15. That's what you call timing. So young music. So it's not just being nostalgic or over romantic. There is so much to learn, and as I said earlier, American music is so much appreciated overseas.
Yes,
and I just wish and hope that there'd be more awareness,
even within the U.S.
Yes,
of specifically even certain genres within American music might be not studied or looked on as much as, or even nowadays with younger generations even coming up.
I think the one musical style which has managed to preserve itself very well is bluegrass music.
Yeah.
And Cajun music down in Louisiana. A lot of young bands who've come up and realised the value of their heritage. So it's not all doom and gloom.
Yeah.
And I have to say, on Long Island, we've got Gene Casey.
Yes.
Wonderful. I suppose you almost call him a rockabilly artist.
I've had him on.
Oh, wonderful!
Here as well.
Wonderful. He is just, his shows that everyone has just got a smile on their face from beginning to end. So people like Gene are really preserving that heritage which I'm describing.
And also, in terms of other people on the North Fork, you've worked with other people like Joe Loro or Red Kelly?
Yes, Joe Loro he worked very closely with Ara Padnos at the Ponderosa Stomp, and Joe's speciality is vintage film clips, and so I can remember, for example, he did a lovely movie on compilation on Bo Diddley, vintage film. But I suppose his greatest moment, from my point of view, was the film was called The Big Beat. It was the Fats Domino story, and it's a full-length movie, and Joe was able to incorporate his archive material.
Yes.
And I can remember he lived then on Shelter Island, and we did a little filmed interview, and so I had my 2 minutes of fame in the movie. But no, Joe has just done a wonderful job in preserving these as much vintage film clips of these original artists as you could wish for, and he operates here in Greenport.
Greenport, yeah.
Red Kelly, wonderful man. I first met him in 2009 at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, and it was when my book Record Makers had just come up, and or just been published, and I did a signing session, and Red and his wife Georgette asked me to sign the book. And then he said, "Oh, we got discussing a little bit," and he said, "Oh, I live on Long Island." Well, I was living in East Setauket. He was living in South Jamesport, and so, and then he said, "Oh, I've got a boat." I thought, this sounds good. It was just a little motor boat, but it was a boat. But then we started to have lunches together at the Turquoise at Riverhead and so on. And we just found we had so much in common. Red was known as the Soul Detective, and he'd set up this website. And what he was doing was interviewing obscure soul artists like Joe Hayward, and then documenting artists like O.V. Wright and so on. He learned how to write computer language, and so he put them up on his website, the Soul Detective. And then we, with our common interest in New Orleans, we discussed with a friend in England, John Ridley, Red and myself, about setting up this website called the Cosmo Code, which documented the recordings. I mentioned earlier Cosmo Matassa, who was the only studio owner in New Orleans. And we worked out that each recording had been allocated a master number, which wonderfully was in sequence despite being on several different labels. So we assembled the Cosmo Code together, and I suppose a great thing, two things with Red really from my point of view was he recharged my batteries. I've been doing this for I don't know how many decades. And but he had such enthusiasm. But he was also more in the Southern soul field, and I was taking an interest, but I had nowhere near the knowledge that he had. So he dragged me along, if you like. And then we went on these road trips, and almost annual, sometimes once every 2 years. But we'd get in the car, he would pick me up at East Setauket, and we'd head off for Nashville, for Memphis. We went once to a rockabilly festival in Newport, Arkansas. Muscle Shoals, which of course is the home of soul music. Those great Aretha Franklin recordings, and so at the Fame Studios. And then we also did a road trip down to New Orleans once. And the whole way was this is really the home of the blues, the home of soul music, the Deep South, in other words. And so just very sadly, Red died in 2022. And just so much to give. I suppose one of the abiding memories really is that Red became very friendly with a guitarist called Reggie Young, and Reggie was a Memphis-based guitarist, and then he made his way to Nashville, and Reggie and Jenny became family friends with Red and Georgette, and I should never forget going down to their home in Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, and just having a lovely dinner with Reggie, another good friend of mine, Colin Escott, great researcher, and Red. And Reggie was just one of those guitar players. Two examples. He created a great line of Son of a Preacher Man, Dusty Springfield. Everybody should just go to that on YouTube. Just totally innovative. And another famous song is Drift Away by Dobie Gray. And the opening lines to that, you just hear one note and you know it's Drift Away. And that was just this marvellous guitar player. And Reggie ended up with the Highwaymen, with Johnny Cash, Waylon Jennings, Chris Christopherson, and Willie Nelson. And it was through Red that able to meet this great man, who really was just a humble Southerner, just had so much natural talent.
Yes.
And a bit like Jimmy Spore in New York.
Yeah.
Ought to be a statue to Reggie hung in Nashville.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, Red was just inspirational. And just as I say, recharge my batteries, and we're keeping on in his honour.
Yes.
And I'm delighted to hear that his daughter Nina is working here at the library.
Yes. And that's kind of how the two of us got connected through Nina, so it's all brings us all together, and was really important, I think, to talk about. Was there any other last minute things you'd like to say?
I think we've covered the bases, really.
Thank you so much for taking the time to come on today and share your story. I really enjoyed talking with you today.
Well, thank you, Chris. I've really enjoyed it.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 122 with John Broven. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.